The 26th President of the United States said, "Cherish the natural resources. Cherish the history and romance as a sacred heritage for your children and your children's children." Director of Conservation for Bass Pro, Martin McDonald.
We've been really good water stewards in the Ozarks, but we're not done with the mission of clean water yet.
Teddy Roosevelt's vision became crystal clear when the government began tackling environmental issues and creating agencies to enforce laws. Director of Missouri Department of Natural Resources, Sarah Parker Pauley.
DNR brings together functions of the state that have some responsibility in certainly protecting our natural resources and interpreting and protecting the finest examples of our natural and cultural resources.
Water conservationists believe those new laws turned our streams from flammable to floatable.
Water is our most precious resource, so if you want to put energy and effort into something, it's water, it's our lifeblood.
But as society evolves, Holly Neal hopes politicians can keep regulations flowing smoothly. That's where the Clean Water Rule comes into play.
It's not really something just crazy new. It's actually an attempt at restoring and clarifying and defining these waters that have been in limbo for a number of years.
Neal says the rule introduced this year will protect streams and lakes once ignored.
Rivers are systems, and so it's all interconnected, and so it plays a variety of roles in your typical Southwest Missouri lifestyle.
The authoring agency says the rule helps determine protected headwaters. Ken Kaposis is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water with the Environmental Protection Agency.
There has to be enough flow that there are physical characteristics of a bed and banks and also a high water mark.
But some in Washington have concerns the EPA may be overstepping their boundaries.
What you don't want is a federal government that seeks jurisdiction that makes it difficult for families to have good paying jobs and makes it difficult to have economic opportunity.
According to the EPA, 60% of streams fall into a gray area where it may or may not be protected by the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Rule would change that. The EPA says the rule helps those property owners understand their protections or restrictions.
Stakeholders all across the country asked us to author a new rule that would provide more clarity as to what constituted waters of the United States.
This is economically a ridiculous place for the EPA to be, but the EPA is used to being in ridiculous places, and we need to continue to push back on their overreach.
In 1972, Congress defined the protected waters. Senator Roy Blunt says if anyone changes that definition in 2015, it needs to be those in the Capitol.
The joint meeting will come to order.
This is really one of the great examples of huge overreach by the government, and it also is an example of the government not wanting to do what the law says the government can do.
Neal says it'll take a nationwide effort to keep our waters clean for generations to come.
We all need water, and I think this Clean Water Rule actually plays a significant role in helping protect and improve our waterways.
Now, throughout the week, we'll explain the history of the Clean Water Act and the Environmental Protection Agency, plus a look at how county and state regulations may differ. Lastly, an industry fueling off the land is saying the changes are not needed and would be detrimental to their pockets. All those stories right here on KOLR 10 at 10.
Around the Ozarks tonight, we introduced you last night to the Clean Water Rule, which aims to clarify what waters fall under the jurisdiction of the Environmental Protection Agency.
For more than 40 years, in fact, the EPA has been tasked with protecting the environment, our country's land, air, waste, and water. KOLR 10's Linda Ong looked into the history of the EPA and the Clean Water Act force and what led to this pivotal point in our nation's history.
It was April 22nd, 1970. The first Earth Day. A nationwide rally that spread coast to coast, often thought of as the birth of the modern environmental movement.
We protest an economic system which virtually dictates the ruin of our environment.
Industry-driven pollution reached a breaking point that sparked national outrage. In 1952 and again in 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught fire, catching national attention. Barbara Lux is the sustainability officer for Springfield.
20 million people took to the streets just to say enough. They were very concerned about their environment. People were beginning to see something really needed to be done, and they looked to the government to do that.
Months later, that call was answered. President Richard Nixon signed an executive order to establish the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA.
In the early days, I think it was somewhat easier for the regulators at EPA because the problems were so severe. They were very visual in terms of impairments and problems, and in some ways I think it made it easier to get public support to clean up the pollution.
The EPA's role in protecting our nation's waters has remained largely unchanged, writing and enforcing regulations. Lauren Bullard is the former executive director of Watershed Committee of the Ozarks.
The playing field has changed politically, and it's changed in terms of, the industries understanding how they can fight these new rules and things like that. So there's a lot more pressure on the EPA.
This pressure stems from the 1972 Clean Water Act, the federal law governing water pollution. Now, the main controversy is what defines navigable waters, because what is deemed navigable is protected and regulated by the EPA from pollution.
There were two Supreme Court cases, one in 2001 and one in 2006, that addressed this issue but didn't answer the question.
The EPA then authored a rule to clarify these waters of the United States. But opponents spanning different industries say the rule is still open to interpretation.
I have never witnessed so many new rules and regulations.
Skills!
Farmer Tom Huff is among 120,000 families that are part of the Missouri Farm Bureau, the voice of Missouri agriculture. He says farmers are all for clean water, but are against what he calls overregulation.
Under their current rule, would require a EPA permit to do common farming practices. There is nowhere on my farm that would not fall under this new rule.
Environmentalists say this is hardly the case.
The EPA is our first line of defense. They have an accountability that has to be met, and sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle.
It's clear the debate won't end anytime soon, but there is one thing opponents and supporters of the EPA do agree on.
This convergence of people who have a shared value of the environment and the enjoyment, that wanting to leave a legacy.
To a farmer, every day is Earth Day. You have to take care of the water. Anyone who abuses the land or abuses the water are not going to be successful.
Linda Ong, Color 10 News, Ozarks.
Around the Ozarks at 10 tonight, we continue our in-depth look into the Clean Water Act and the impact it may have on area lakes and streams. Tonight, we're diving into the 3-tier regulations beginning in our nation's capital.
Our Brett Martin is here tonight to explain how federal laws play a role in how our state and counties regulate them. Brett?
David and Jennifer, the Clean Water Act was created in 1972. 2 years after that, the Department of Natural Resources was established here in Missouri. Since then, they've helped counties make sure companies and other communities are keeping the water quality up to par. It's been 43 years since Congress established the Clean Water Act, a plan breaking down regulations to protect our nation's waters. Under that law, states like Missouri created their own agencies to enforce the regulations of the EPA.
DNR is the agency within the state of Missouri that has the authority to enforce not only the federal Clean Water Act, but also the Missouri Clean Water Law.
Director of Natural Resources Sarah Parker Pauley says the Clean Water Act requires the state to meet or exceed the federal regulations.
We have over 115,000 miles of streams and rivers that come under the protection of the Department of Natural Resources, over 3,000 lakes and reservoirs that have protections.
DNR does that by requiring permits for sources of approved polluters along waterways.
We have permits across the state. We have over 10,000 point sources of pollution that we have responsibility to ensure compliance.
As a point source is where you can go and find the source, the point, and you can point back upstream and find out whose waste it is.
Joe Pitts is a water conservation expert who worked with the Department of Natural Resources and the James River Basin Partnership. Pitts says those permits help monitor water quality. This map shows all the permits DNR has on file within the basin.
They have a permit that allows them to discharge pollutants up to a certain level and not above that. And if they go above that, then they've exceeded their permit and they're in violation of the law.
According to DNR, there are hundreds of different permits for discharges within the James River Basin. Out of those permits, 36 different communities dump their treated wastewater into streams that flow into the river. Similar to the federal level, states require counties to meet or exceed their regulations. Tim Davis is the environmental compliance manager for Greene County.
The EPA tells the states to tell the counties what we're supposed to do as far as regulating.
Davis says county regulations may differ because of the topography and dependability in the region.
A lot of our economy is based on water quality. I mean, you got tourism down in Branson and Table Rock. You got Bass Pro Shops here, a lot of outdoor recreation.
Pitts believes this creates a patchwork of regulation because
watersheds do not recognize political boundaries in any shape or form.
But if the Clean Water Rule passes, Missouri State Representative Lincoln Huff believes the permit load would sink the system.
Again, what I don't know is, are we required now to have a permit to operate in the agricultural environment that we've been operating under for the last 15 or 20 years.
The Clean Water Rule would protect many creeks running through the watersheds, which means folks living in the rural part of the state, if they plan to change the land around it, would have to file for a permit. Pitts says the system helps hold people accountable for their actions upstream.
It's designed so that you as an upstream landowner can't take an action that makes that water unavailable to a downstream water user.
There's no way that they can actually oversee the goings-on of every single landowner in every part of the state.
What is tough to regulate is non-permitted sources of pollution like stormwater runoff.
Non-point source pollution comes from everywhere.
Pitts says the lack of clarity impacts everyone.
Regulators are not certain about whether they should regulate.
It's funny that the EPA says what we're doing is trying to provide certainty to the business people, to the farmers, when you're doing absolutely the opposite.
Parker Pauley believes everyone deserves a chance to have pristine waters like what we enjoy in the Ozarks.
Everybody wants clean water. Everybody needs clean water.
And tomorrow night, we'll look into one of the loudest groups pushing back against the Clean Water Rule. You can see that right here on KOLR.
Around the Ozarks now at 10 tonight, two of the biggest money-making industries in our region are on the opposite ends of the Clean Water Rule and the waters of the United States.
Our Brett Martin joins us now with a look at why the agriculture industry says the new rule would hurt operations across the state. Brett.
David and Jennifer, both the agriculture and recreation industries bring billions of dollars to the Show Me State, but farmers in southwest Missouri say if the rule is established, it could create extra work for current and future farmers. Farmers will say living on a farm is a routine each and every day. It's a routine Glenn Cope knows well.
Me, and as well as my dad and my brother and our wives, and you know, it's just part of our legacy, part of our life here.
Cope owns more than 500 acres south of Aurora in Lawrence County.
We just have primarily commercial cows, crossbred cows that we raise for beef.
Raising commercial cattle puts him amongst some of the loudest opponents of the proposed Clean Water Rule by the EPA.
People need to realize that we as farmers and ranchers, we want to make sure that the land is protected. We want to make sure that we leave it as good as we found it.
Since 1972, normal farming operations have been exempt from many of the Clean Water Act's regulations. Water conservation expert Joe Pitts.
EPA or the Department of Natural Resources have never gone onto someone's property and said your pond here where you water your cattle, for instance, is polluted by the runoff from the cattle.
Planting seeds, building irrigation ditches, and plowing the land are all examples of normal farming that's exempt from the Clean Water Act. Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water with the EPA, Ken Kaposis, says those same exemptions fall under the clarification of the waters of the United States.
We did not expand jurisdiction into a farmer's field. And all of the existing exclusions that already existed in the statute or in the old rule, we carried every one of those forward as well.
But still, many farmers say there are more questions than answers.
We don't do things that are harmful to our plants, our animals, because they are what feeds our family.
Missouri State Representative Lincoln Huff is also a farmer. He says he isn't sure if a creek running through his land in northern Greene County would be protected or not.
This is a stream that obviously flows into another creek or stream that flows into another that could be a tributary that goes into a larger waterway that then flows into a navigable waterway.
And if so, would folks like him have to change their daily routine?
Anytime that I was to oversee these fields or re-drill or plant a crop or something like that, again, the uncertainty is there as to whether or not now I'm supposed to have a permit.
Your typical farmer will find no change in how they plant, harvest their crops going forward.
Cope says ponds and creeks are vital for ranchers, so putting their usage in limbo is detrimental.
A pond might need the mud taken out of it so that it'll hold enough water later on when it gets dry again, so that it'll have enough water for the cows.
See, it does not say that you have to take steps to protect your private pond, that the ditch in front of your house is going to be regulated.
Pitts doesn't believe small farms will be impacted by the change. Most existing regulations are aimed at industrial farms, which have been in place since the 1980s.
The vast majority of agricultural operations, I'm talking not industrial, but farm, just small farms, will never have anything going on that has to deal with that.
But Huff questions the way the rule is written.
99.7% of the state of Missouri is within a 4,000-foot requirement, or could be interpreted within 4,000 feet of a significant nexus.
Huff says Missouri knows the importance of agriculture and clean streams.
We do it because we love providing for our families and we love the environment that we get to exist in.
Because Cope says Missouri is more than just a flyover state when it comes to farming.
If you look out of a plane window, if you're flying over our state, and you look down at the ground, there is bodies of water everywhere.
And right now, the Clean Water Rule is currently stalled nationwide in a U.S. Court of Appeals. The EPA is currently using their regulation system from before to monitor their jurisdiction. Now, tomorrow night, we'll dig into that decision to find out where it may be headed.
Around the Ozarks tonight, we continue our look into the Clean Water Act and its impact on Ozarks waterways. All week long, we've told you how it regulates, why it was formed, and why one big industry is against the new regulations.
And tonight, our Brett Martin is here to explain why the proposed Clean Water Rule is not being enforced just yet. Brett?
David and Jennifer, the Clean Water Rule is a clarification of what the Clean Water Act was supposed to protect when it was signed in 1972. That act says any navigable water is protected by the EPA. After 2 Supreme Court cases, the EPA came back with the Clean Water Rule, but some politicians say not so fast because of the overreach from the federal government. The Clean Water Rule hit a significant dam on its way to enforcement after a U.S. Court of Appeals put a stay on the rule. Holly Neal with the Missouri Stream Team Watershed Coalition.
We have the chance to kind of restore this portion of the Clean Water Act, and to lose that opportunity, I think, would be a negative.
The proposed changes went into effect on August 28th, but stalled in October because the Court of Appeals wanted to consider the impact of the monumental change in oversight. That change would add 60% more of America's streams and rivers to the EPA's protections.
This is on hold nationwide. They had over 1 million public comments, and over 80% of those comments were in support of the rule.
The new regulations will clarify the definition of waters of the U.S. to include headwaters as waterways that flow into navigable streams, which are protected by the Clean Water Act and redefined by a 2006 Supreme Court case.
The agencies should be focused on those waters where there is a significant nexus and an opportunity for a significant effect from upstream waters to downstream waters.
The debate over the Clean Water Rule is a politically charged issue. Just this week, the U.S. Senate failed to pass legislation, which would have forced the EPA back to the drawing board, but the Senate did pass a resolution for disapproval.
We have to look to the reach, to the impact of this rule, and then determine whether or not it is appropriate.
Neal says the pushback is not something we should endorse.
We should be supporting our waterways because we all know we all need water, and I think this Clean Water Rule actually plays a significant role.
I'm not opposed to a healthy and clean environment, and no farm boy ever would be. What I'm opposed to is an overreach that doesn't make sense.
Missouri Senator Roy Blunt says there's a right way to change a 43-year-old rule.
The only way they should get more jurisdiction than that is to come to the Congress and convince the Congress and whoever's president at the time to change the law.
And if not, there are steps Congress can take with funding to fight back.
It means no government resources can be used to implement the law, which means it won't get implemented.
While the 6th District Court of Appeals issued a stay, the ruling does say the definition of waters of the U.S. has been clouded, and they do appreciate the need for a new rule.
The risk factor, if we don't go forward with the regulation, is that we're talking about approximately 1/2 of the stream miles in this country will not be fully protected.
Neal says America can't afford to let waters go unprotected for much longer.
I think that's the bottom line, is how do we want to leave the earth behind, and we want to give something better to our children and our future generations.
And the court made its ruling in the beginning of October. For now, the EPA has been ordered to go back to their original regulations following the 2001 and 2006 Supreme Court cases.
Any timetable, Brett, on that final ruling, though?
Short answer, no. Senator Blunt says that it could take weeks, months, or even years. So, of course, it'll be something we continue to follow.
All right, Brett Martin tonight.